superannuation is a really tax-effective environment, particularly if you know how to play the game and you know how to utilize that system to your advantage, or you know a good financial advisor that does. It can be a massive wealth accumulator or a really big accelerator towards your wealth accumulation journey. So
welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are. We are back again and we are talking about all things money.
We are, Andrew. We're back into the recording studio week in, week out, coming over the airways to our listeners and our viewers, bringing a whole heap of value. And today we're talking all about superannuation, but specifically how to choose, or not necessarily how to choose, but what to think of when choosing a superannuation fund, because it's not as, I don't think it's as simple as everyone thinks in terms of when you, actually the exercise itself is simple, but when you sort of unravel the layers of the onion, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. And I think it's good to bring that to people's attention.
Yeah, I mean, look, you consider the value that's in it. I mean, most people, you're talking about 12%, well, what's going to be 12% of all of your income if you're an employee is going towards something. Mm-hmm. And what I find really peculiar is that 12% of your income going towards something, and people are a bit blasé and nonchalant, and it's just, oh, yeah, whatever, haven't really looked at my Superfund, don't know what's happening, don't know how much is in there, versus the amount of money that people invest, which very often is less than 12% of your income, and people really look at it closely. And the point that I'm trying to illustrate is not don't look at your investment outside super, but rather, hey, you've got a very, very substantial amount of your money going towards something that is, in essence, your money. It's just you're not going to be able to access it for a little bit. And having some focus, having some attention on what's happening with it is really important.
You kind of owe it to yourself.
Absolutely. You owe it to your future self.
Well, let's be realistic, right? I mean, it is your money. The fact that you can't access it for a period of time doesn't really change the fact. And I think it's almost like if you apply it to a different asset class, and I always keep going back to property, right?
Because we love property in Australia and on the podcast.
Yeah, not only that, I think it's just more tangible, right? But if someone said you're going to have access to a property that's worth $1 million in 30 years' time, but you can maintain it, you can tweak it, you can improve the garden, you can do certain stuff, right? Whatever it may be. I guarantee you that person would know exactly the state of the property, what needs to happen. They're probably doing work on it once a year or whatever it is. They're probably driving past it every so often. That's exactly the same. If you think about it from a superannuation perspective, you can't really do anything with it. You can tinker with it and stuff, but you can't make any substantial changes per se. But if it was property, I think putting it into that context, we'd see a different approach towards it. And all I'm really trying to highlight here is that if you think about the value that your superannuation can derive and be worth and what it can and should do for you in the future, you'd be absolutely mad not to give it the TLC, the love, the attention that it deserves.
Absolutely. So, all right, we've covered off on, why you should maybe pay some attention to it. What is it? I mean, how do you describe a super fund? I think that's kind of a bit of a starting point in understanding sort of some of the considerations that you'd have when you're trying to select one.
Yeah, so I think even before that, because there's a slight wording that I want to pick up on here, but how do you decide on a superannuation fund? Before we get to the fun part, before we get to the fun and fund part, that's a mouthful.
Yep.
Let's just talk about superannuation per se as a environment and a legislated tax environment essentially. But all superannuation is merely a trust environment that's concessionally taxed, that has certain legislative rules around it about how much money you can put into it, the taxation rate that is applied to it, and when you can take money out and in what circumstances.
Yeah.
All it is that. It doesn't stipulate what it needs to be invested in and different bits and pieces. There are some stuff, which we'll talk about in a sec. But essentially, if you just think of it as a legal structure, first and foremost, I think you get your thinking right there and then go, okay, how do I then invest in that type of environment? I use a superannuation fund, or I buy assets in something like a self-managed superannuation fund.
Yep.
And access investments and assets that way. But the legislative framework is the same.
Yep.
So I think thinking about it from a legislative perspective versus from a fund point of view, I think that's a huge differentiation between the two.
Yeah, exactly right. And so in essence, superannuation is just, in essence, a trust. Now, whether it's in XYZ Superfund or whether it's in ABC superannuation fund, the rules, the regulations, absolutely everything is identical. Yep. The only difference is, what are some of the investments and what are some of the, differences in the actual products. But the environment of superannuation is just merely a trust. It's a trust that is, we say concessionally taxed, but in essence, what that means is the tax rate that is applied to it is outside of your normal tax rates. For the vast majority of people, it's a much lower tax rate. Generally, you're looking at 15% tax in superannuation while you're growing your wealth. Mm-hmm. And then once you've finished growing your wealth and you're drawing money out of it, it's at a 0% tax environment.
Hang on, Andrew, say that again. Did you say 0% tax?
0% tax environment. So you're talking about a very, very powerful tax trust. Yep. Is kind of the way that I like to think of superannuation. Now, all of, how it's structured underneath that is completely up to you, and you can go to whatever level of detail that you ultimately want to go to with it. But it's basically just a trust that's tax effective, that has some limits on how much you can put in and how much you can draw out. That's all that it is.
Yeah, and probably the other thing around that is the tax effectiveness of superannuation is, well, at least in Australia, we won't talk about other jurisdictions, but as far as I know, the rest of the world. But I don't think, other than maybe your owner-occupier, where you can sell an asset that's exempt from capital gains tax, I don't think there's anything else in the country that provides a better taxation opportunity than superannuation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you consider that factor alone by itself is absolutely huge, which is what you were alluding to. If then you go and take the rules of preservation, essentially what that means is when you can put your hand in the bucket, right? When you can access it. If you think that money is essentially legislated to be stuck in there until certain things happen, but let's talk about retirement or finishing your working career, it's stuck in there for 4 decades, depending on your time frame, right? If you think about the power of a compounded investment, the longer you leave it, the greater the compounding effect takes place. Yep. So you've got not only a concessionally taxed environment, but you've also got this money that's locked up in there. Oh, also at the same time, it's legislated that your employer has to pay into it on a continuous basis on your behalf. So you've got these 3 things that are working together to create this really big and powerful retirement nest egg for us as individuals to eventually provide retirement income. So I think the fact that we've got continuous money going into it, and I think the fact that it's stuck in there for a period of time where it can allow it to compound for decades and decades really shows the power of superannuation and how we can say that something that's, only 11.5 or 12% of our package goes into superannuation. If you work it through, use a compounding calculator and work those numbers, we're talking huge amounts of money when somebody eventually finishes in their working career.
Yeah. And you also throw on top of that within certain limits, but additional contributions that you make towards superannuation, you also get a tax deduction on. The compound effect of not only the tax benefits when you put money in and getting a tax deduction on putting money in, the tax benefits on the investments initially at a rate of 15%, and then the tax benefits, eventually at 0%. I think the general thing that you can, throw out there pretty comfortably is that superannuation is a really tax effective environment, particularly if you know how to play the game and you know how to utilize that system to your advantage, or a good financial advisor that does. It can be a massive wealth accumulator or a really big accelerator towards your wealth accumulation journey. So I think that the general, thing that I'll sort of maybe wrap this all up in is this is an environment that has its restrictions, because how much you put in and how much you draw out and when you can do that, there are some rules around that. But provided that you can play within those parameters, it creates a massive tax opportunity. So the amount of times that we talk to people about, I'm paying too much tax, what can I do? Superannuation is something that is a massive tool in your arsenal to be able to assist in that, provided that you know how to use it correctly.
Yeah, no, well said. Andrew, time to get into the fun stuff and talk about the funds per se. But so we've spoken about superannuation as a trust, as a legislative environment. Let's get specific around the different types of superannuation funds and what does that look like and some of the differences. And then at the same time, we might talk about who it's appropriate for and what we tend to see. But the legislative environment is the same. When we go one step down into the fund world, it then starts to get different. It starts to then differentiate between what they offer, who it's relevant for, who should be thinking about it, and basically, what does that look like? And even getting to the extent about the investments that sit inside those as well too, because that is a really critical element as well too. But let's kick it off. What are some of the different types of superannuation funds?
So really in Australia, there's 4 general categories of superannuation super funds that you can have. There's an industry super fund, great ads, like you would have, seen the ads associated with it. But in essence, born out of supporting a specific industry initially, not so much these days, but they were usually supporting the industry that you worked in. So if you, for instance, worked in the retail industry, you'd usually have a REST superannuation fund. Different funds will have like the building, building industry will be CBUS. And they would usually invest back into the industry that you invest in. Not as much these days. Their investments are a lot more broad. But usually when you're considering an industry type of superannuation fund, it generally has a more limited investment option. So your customization on the fund, what you can do, what you can invest in is generally a little bit more limited. It's a bit more general to the investment that the fund decides to take rather than the investment that you decide to take. And it's usually quite a bit more of a simple structure from an investment perspective. But because of that, generally costs are a little bit cheaper in an industry type of superannuation fund.
Yeah, so we tend to find with those ones as well too that when your balance is smaller, so say you're starting out in the workforce, that tends to be a really good choice and a really good option for people, simply because the costs associated with it and the investment options and the insurance, which we'll talk about in a second, is quite simplistic. But at the start, realistically, I think what you're trying to do is not only where most people start, but you're trying to grow your balance as much as you possibly can. So that's a really good simplistic solution for most people, is to start out with an industry style fund.
Yep, absolutely.
Andrew, we then get on to a retail style fund.
Yep. So most retail funds, and again, not all, but most were born out of the banking sector. So banking industry started to offer superannuation products whereby they were similar in nature in the construction of the fund, where a lot of the times it's still a little bit more simple in terms of the fund itself, but the investment options within the fund are generally a little bit more broad. So where, an industry fund will only offer their own investment options, you usually will see a retail fund have investment options with different providers. So, some of the examples that you might see in that is you might be looking at a, retail fund like Colonial, for argument's sake, or MLC. and they'll offer investment options with Vanguard, which is, a different investment provider to the fund itself. So in essence, a retail fund will generally have a little bit more options from an investment perspective and a little bit more of a choice in how you can structure your investments within your superannuation fund.
Yep. And Andrew, with that, how does insurance fit into that one?
So insurance will fit into it in that, most funds these days will allow for what's called external rollovers. So you can have a superannuation fund that's an industry super fund and an insurance product that sits outside of the superannuation fund itself. And what will happen is, let's say you've got apologies whether if you can sort of follow this because I'm using my hands and trying to talk here. But you might have a superannuation fund that sits with an industry super fund or a retail super fund, and you might have an insurance that will sit inside of superannuation but not inside of the fund itself. Yeah. So you select insurances with anyone on the market. What will happen is when premiums need to get paid, they'll open up a temporary super fund. They'll transfer money from your super fund into that temporary super fund to pay for the insurance premiums. Then that will close the fund, and that'll happen each and every single year to keep your insurances rolling. Or what Billy is referring to is having your insurances inside of your superannuation fund where the premiums just get deducted on a weekly or a monthly basis. Now, a retail superannuation fund will usually have a little bit more choice and customization and quality in terms of insurances that you're applying for within those funds versus an industry super fund where a lot of those are just automatic acceptance insurance policies that do have quite a few restrictions when you're going to claim on that policy at a future date.
And then the third one that we tip into is what's called a wrap platform. So this is kind of where you get your investment banks, and, the banking sector per se has created, similar to a retail type of product, something that's a little bit more advanced in terms of, the functionality. The investment options is a huge one with this, where you might find somebody who has an interest in or a skill set in investing, so they want to take a bit more of an active approach with their superannuation. Maybe it gives them the ability to invest in different types of assets, whether it be direct Australian shares, whether it could be, some fund managers overseas, whether it be certain ETFs. It's a more sophisticated product that really opens up in our world, really opens up the investment options that are available for an investor to be able to choose from. And then at the same time as well too, there's complete flexibility around which insurance provider you go with, because a lot of these wrap style platforms don't have their own inbuilt insurance similar to those previous two that you were talking about. So we tend to see that people tend to graduate their way through the different types of superannuation funds. As they're progressing through their life stages, their needs get a little bit more complicated, their balances increase as they work their way through.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill's last one, I'm sure that people have heard about it, but self-managed super fund.
Yeah, self-managed super fund is an interesting thing per se. The reason why self-managed has got, has gained in popularity the way that it has is because of the ability to invest in direct property. So if you consider the other three types of superannuation funds that we spoke about, there's certain things that you cannot invest in those that you can invest in a self-managed super fund, property being the most common and the most well-known one. There are some other things around there, if you've got a certain skill set around collectibles, art, bullion, diamonds, a whole range of different things.
Basically, that's an investment asset. Right?
Wines, antiques, you name it. There are some rules that sit around it. But the one that I tend to focus on the most, which is the one that I guess most people are used to, is property. So inside a self-managed super fund, you can purchase a property, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial. Self-managed super fund is really popular with business owners because that's the only environment or the only situation where you can be the owner of a property in your self-managed super fund, and your business can be the tenant, and you can basically lease the premises back to yourself through your self-managed super fund. So that's one that we see that's really, really common. And that's the one that I think most people sort of know self-managed super fund for.
Yeah. And I think one of the other benefits associated with that is if you're investing in a superannuation fund in any other environment, one of the rules with superannuation is that you're not able to take on any borrowings. So you can only use your own funds. A self-managed super fund, while in itself can't borrow money, it can through what's called the Bear Trust. So you can open up a separate trust which has borrowings associated with it. And so if you're wanting to, obviously you're taking on the risk that's associated with it, but if you're wanting to really accelerate your wealth and take on an element of risk with it, you can take some borrowings against your superannuation money to purchase things like a property. And so that opens up the ability to leverage and act as an accelerator for your wealth accumulation. So a self-managed super fund can be, for some people, a really powerful tool. It can be your biggest detriment as well. And likewise with any of these superannuation products, provided that you're utilizing it correctly and for what it's intended for, it can be a very, very powerful tool. But sometimes when you're making the jump too quickly or you're doing things without, the full gambit of information, you're in a product that you're paying additional fees, additional costs that you don't need to be paying, which does bring us onto the cost conversation, which we'll talk about in a second as well. But there has been a big push towards a conversation around cost when you're assessing a superannuation fund. And that's relevant. It absolutely is, but it's not the be all and end all. So really considering what you're getting for that cost is ultimately what's going to determine what is the right superannuation fund for you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point, because that's almost the only thing that you can compare superannuation funds on a like-for-like comparison, simply because when you dig down and look at the underlying investment options that sit inside a super fund, every superannuation fund invests in different things. Even if you've got the same approach to risk and the same risk profile, in the industry, the most common thing that we see is a balanced risk profile. What that means is 70% of the money that's sitting inside a superannuation fund is invested in growth assets. The other 30% are sitting in defensive. So what we tend to see is, even if you have that same 70-30 split, if you're in one style of fund and I'm in a different type of fund, those investment options will be different. So comparing the performance of the underlying investment options is not like for like. The only thing that we can really compare on is cost, which I think is the reason why it gets so much attention. And yes, absolutely, cost is a key determining factor. But if you go one step further, I think looking at the underlying investment options, what you're invested in, how much risk you're taking, is definitely a logical thing to talk about, which we'll jump on now. And I don't think we can also have this discussion without thinking about the insurance aspect as well too. So Andrew, on the investment front, what are we looking for when it comes to underlying investment options? How do we differentiate? What's the best one?
Look, without trying to overcomplicate this, so apologies in advance for it, comparing investment returns on a superannuation fund, and I say this very begrudgingly because I don't like the fact that it's like this, but it's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult. And the reason I say that is, unfortunately, the superannuation industry has become more of a marketing industry, and this is my chance to have a rant rather than actually provide some tangible info on the podcast. But when you're looking at the superannuation industry in itself, everyone's talking about our fees are the lowest, our performance is the best, we've been the best performing fund for the last 10 years, and it's impossible for all of these funds to all have those claims. So really what they're doing is picking a particular point in time that best represents their fund and then utilizing that for a marketing purpose. So you look at, the top performing fund. It's okay, well, over what time period are you actually comparing? You look at cheapest cost. Okay, cheapest cost, but on what superannuation balance, on what investment option, on how it's actually structured. I mean, some funds are very cheap when you're investing in, simple things like a term deposit, and other funds are going to be more complex and are going to have a larger cost that's associated with it. So making sure that you're comparing on the same time period, making sure that you're comparing on the same investment selection, and making sure that you're comparing on when you're looking at performance, is it pre-fees? Is it net of fees? Is it pre-tax? Is it net of tax? Putting that all into the blender to compare like for like can be a very difficult thing to do. And so, but in essence, when you're trying to make those comparisons from an investment perspective, it needs to be on the same basis. And unfortunately, a lot of it is just marketing at the moment. And I hate to say that.
Yeah, and look, it's not necessarily as simple as that as well too. And let me give you an example. So I'm 39 at the moment. I've got some young kids.
Yep, 39.
My birthday next week, and I'm turning 39 again. If you think about the ability, mortgage, kids, the whole disaster. So if you think about the impacts of my cash flow and my ability to fund and pay for insurance, I can do that through superannuation. So I do, right? If you think about where I'm at in my life, in terms of priority, I am more concerned today because my kids are younger, we've still got a mortgage, all of that sort of stuff. I'm more concerned with having access to the right type of insurance, which costs more money in my superannuation fund than my future superannuation balance. That's a secondary consideration. Yeah. So but fast forward 5, 6, 7 years when the kids are older and I turn 39 again, then I'm not going to be as concerned. We've got less debt. The kids are independent. They're not as reliant on mum and dad, all that sort of stuff. Then it switches. So depending on where you're at in your life stage also has a significant impact in what type of approach that you want to take as well too. Because that fee conversation that you were referring to goes out the window, because if you're going to get a better quality product, you're going to pay more money for it, plain and simple. So if that suits your circumstances, then that makes sense as well too.
Yeah, exactly right. So you really need to take into consideration, one, what's the cost going to be to change at a future point in time? So you need to take into consideration your future circumstances. You need to compare apples with apples when you're looking at investments, when you're looking at structure, and also the insurance that's associated with it. So cost, value, benefit, all of that's associated with the insurance, and put all of that in the blender to find, the right fund that's going to be right for you today, but also the right fund that's most likely to be right for you in, 2, 3, 4, 5 years time, so that you're not, incurring costs of selling one fund to buy another fund, to sell that fund, to buy another fund, paying capital gains, paying buy-sell costs all along the way. And it can be a pretty difficult exercise because there is a bit of complexity and there's a huge amount of options that's there.
We've covered a lot of ground, Andrew, and I think the only consistent message is that it's an area that's full of complexity. The difference between getting it right and getting it wrong can be huge when you look at it over the ramifications, whether it's, from a retirement income balance perspective, whether it's looking at your insurances to make sure that your family's protected. I think the only thing, if we can get a clear message out of the back of it, is I really think it makes sense to get advice, and not doing that to toot our own horn. I think it's more of a public service announcement than anything. Checking where you're at and not doing that, like what you were saying around the percentage of the population and what have you, but not doing that later on in your working career, doing it as early as you possibly can makes sense in my mind, because the difference between getting it right and missing that can be huge down the track.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Bills, thanks again for another awesome podcast and another really interesting topic. It's something that we're hugely passionate about. Thanks to all of our viewers and our listeners. We hope you got some value out of that episode. And if you did, subscribe. It's really important to us and it helps us grow and provide more of this valuable content.
Catch you on the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.